All right, hello everyone. Welcome to week 3, and this is our second official lecture for family violence. We're going to be going over chapter 2, which is the history of family violence. And as always, I want you to take notes. I will upload the PDF version of this presentation into Folio, but you will not have access to my notes. So please make sure that you take notes on this and and just make sure you check out the extra material that's in Folio as we go through. I believe I've linked some Georgia statutes of the different types of family violence. Each type has a statute that goes along with it. So I've put those statutes up in Folio as well. So, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. So of course we're going to start with our learning objectives at the end of this presentation or at the end of the readings today. You should be able to meet these 5 objectives. So you should be able to discuss the early social legal history of family violence, explain the historical significance of social tolerance for family violence, describe the primary categories of family violence, explain what constitutes a domestic relationship, and define the 4 types of violence that occur within the families. So let's start with the historical origins. Family violence is not new. Family violence has been around since the dawn of man. We may have not called it family violence, but the notion of violence and within the family unit has always occurred throughout society. However, recently in our history is when we considered it wrong. And why does it exist? Well, at the root of the historical perspective of family violence, you see this inequality between men and women. And there's a term for that. The term is patriarchy. And so the foundation of intimate partner violence or domestic violence is patriarchy. And patriarchy is the social system that recognizes that men have dominance over women and that women should be submissive to men. And as we go through, and trust me, I know you're rolling your eyes right now, but you will see as we go through the history, this notion of patriarchy is ingrained in all of civil law. And until recently, and really kind of dictates uh, women's role in society. So let's go through the ages and kind of go back to the beginning. So at the beginning, we have the Code of Hammurabi, or Hammurabi, however you want to say it. I'm Southern and I have an accent, so I say Hammurabi. Uh, the Code of Hammurabi was the first law to recognize the notion of human rights. Um, sort of. Realistically, the Code of Hammurabi, it's the earliest known body of law, and it contains specific language uh, dictating the arrangements between husbands and wives. So when we say it's the first to recognize human rights, it's the first to recognize some type of equality of men, not women, of men. And so the Code of Hammurabi kind of reigned supreme throughout uh, the those times until we get to Greece. And when we get to Greece, we start seeing more of a cultural norm being formed in our law. So in Greece, you have Dracon, who is attributed to have the first written laws of Greek culture. Now, Dracon was extremely harsh. Any violation of the law resulted in death. Um, you will hear sometimes the term draconian laws, meaning outdated laws. That's where we get that from. Dracon really thought that if someone violated the law, then they should die. So then in 594 AD, or 594 BC, I'm sorry, the slide is wrong, you have Solon, Solon. Solon was a legal scholar, and he came in and he did away with the draconian laws. He basically said, no, there's not a need to be harsh. Let's create new laws that kind of dictate our behavior in society. And so in these new laws, he was the first that addressed family, the family unit, or he was the first to address family law. And basically, his philosophy was that all citizens should have access to justice and in the court. Now, when we say all citizens, we are not talking about women, and we'll get to that. Women's role in Greek society was very minimalistic. So in his thoughts, in Solon's thoughts, men, all men should have access to justice in the courts. So women's roles were minimized, like I said, but this is where we first start seeing the patriarchy kind of creep in. Of course, they didn't call it patriarchy. That's a relatively new term. But during this time, women were controlled by men, and that was a societal norm. The women had two roles in society: bear children and take care of the household. And that's further emphasized by what the Greek society had in place for women. So women weren't considered full-fledged citizenry as far as being able to participate in government or in lawmaking or anything like that. They were relegated to needing a guardian to oversee them and their actions. And that's where the term kyrios comes in. Kyrios is basically the term for the official guardian of women. And that typically was the father of the family, unless the woman was married. If she was married, then the kyrios was her husband. And as we will see, the kyrios is responsible for the woman's actions, basically. So women weren't considered citizens, and you will see that this notion kind of evolves into property, but they were deemed to need a guardian to oversee them. So then we go to Rome, and if you kind of know any ancient history, you know Greeks and Romans were right there kind of together. And so their social norms and concepts of women were very similar. Patriarchy permeated this culture. In Rome, men were the head of the households. They had full power and control over their wives and children. And this is where the concept of property comes in. Women and children were considered property in Rome. Whereas in Greece, you had the kyrios, who were the guardians of women. and making sure that, and when we say guardians, we're talking about responsible. They were responsible for the women. And in Rome, they didn't call it Kyrios, but it was the same concept. So in Rome, the males, the men, husbands, fathers, were ultimately responsible for everything that the women did. So if the woman tarnished the name of the family by doing something that was against the law or the social norm, then it was the male's responsibility to discipline her. And it was his responsibility to kind of make things right in society. So then we look at the evolution toward the Christian era. And the Christian era is an interesting era in both human rights and in family violence. So the Christian era, you would think, would see more equality. However, not so much. In fact, in ancient Christianity, and you can still see it in the Old Testament of the Bible, if that is what you believe, you still see that patriarchy mindset. So, according to the Old Testament of the Bible, wives are supposed to be subordinate to the husbands. And patriarchy was really ingrained in biblical text to show that in the Christian philosophy, women weren't considered equal under the law or under societal norms. So that's a little bit of the ancient world's philosophy and view on women. Sorry, if you ever see me without one of these, I probably wouldn't talk to me. I typically have to have one of those a day. Um, so we've gone through the ancient law, and we're going to come up to the pre-colonial time in Britain. And Britain operated under what's called common law. An English common law developed over many centuries and can therefore be traced back to the Anglo-Saxon kings and even the Roman law. During the Middle Ages, Anglo-Saxon rulers and their successors, the Normans, issued so-called writs. Writs were legal orders issued by the courts in the name of the sovereign and addressed many different situations, including correcting of injustices. Some writs demanded that defendants appear in court to answer charges, while others ordered restitution of property and wrongful deprivation. However, because the sovereign issued specific writs instead of creating an all-inclusive legal code, justices often had to interpret these writs in individual court decisions. This helped to create the English common law system with its reliance on judicial decisions to create unwritten laws and rules and norms. So although not the first ruler to issue writs, King Henry II of England is sometimes referred to as the father of common law because of his legal innovations, which included expanding access to the courts and promoting strong judicial institutions. So under the notion of common law, you have basically the societal understanding that this is the law. So you had, like I just read, it developed over these various writs that different kings and sovereigns utilized. And so the judicial system, instead of having like a set of laws, relied on what they thought would be common amongst the writs or common laws. This is important because as part of the common law, you still see patriarchy. As part of the common law, you still see women and children being relegated to the role of property. So nothing has changed through the Middle Ages into British common law. You still see women being subjected to whatever their husband or their father deems fit, because they're not viewed as true citizens in an individualistic sense. They're considered their husband's or their father's property. So then we go to the early settlers in the colonial times here in America. So, going back to our history classes, we know that the early settlers were British citizenry who came over to discover a new world. And so we have to realize at the onset, these were British citizens. And that's important because they still operated under the standards that they were accustomed to with English common law. So essentially, at America's founding, with the colonization, patriarchy, the notion of patriarchy, was brought to the new land. And with that, um, it kind of evolved. So under patriarchy, it was okay to strike a woman. It was okay again, for the husband, and it was seen as the husband's responsibility to kind of discipline his wife whenever she got out of line. And so that was brought over from English common law. However, the Puritans were the first group of people to prohibit what we deem as intimate partner violence. So the Puritans were the first to recognize the issue of, hey, you know, we might still not see women as equal to men, but we do see that there is an issue that men should not just beat their wives for the fun of it, or when they deem that the wife has gotten out of line. So they're the ones that really kind of put in the first set of rules and regulations around not freely beating, hitting, pushing a female. They really saw this as a social problem. So, in that sense, they wanted more of a community. So remember that the settlers, the Puritans, were building this new world. And in order to build this new world, they really didn't look at individualistic expectations. They looked at it as a community expectation of everything. So family violence really is no different in this. They saw this as a social problem that the community itself needed to tackle. If a member of their community was hurting his wife, then the community needed to rally around that and make sure that that problem was addressed. So we know that the Puritans came over and they were not the first people on this land that we deem America. We know that there were many Native Americans already on this land. And in the Native American cultures, whereas the culture of the time for Britain and all of the Western fronts were that of patriarchy. Flip that for the Native Americans. The Native American culture operated on a matriarchal system, which means that everything operated from the woman's side of the family. So your lineage was traced from your mother or from the female in that society. Inheritance, your name, all of that came from the mother and her side of the family. Well, this was in complete contrast to everything that the early American settlers knew. After all, they were still operating on patriarchy, right? So they saw it as their duty to um, change the way that the Native Americans operated. In a matriarchal system, the females did a lot of the work, and so the females did a lot of the gardening, the farming, all of that. Men basically hunted and fished and brought in food. So the settlers were really kind of not okay with this. They saw it as their duty to bring their view of social norms into the new world that they were colonizing. And so, in order to do this, they clashed with the Native Americans and basically had to indoctrinate the Native American children and those in that society to the colonial viewpoints and the colonial ideologies. So, how did they do that? Well, as they were settling the lands and expanding into what we know as America, um, they would kick Native Americans out of their land, or if the Native Americans stayed, those children were sent to boarding schools. And the whole purpose of those boarding schools for those children was to indoctrinate them into the Western philosophy of patriarchy, and making sure that they knew what the true outlook of the American settlers were as far as the value of women, because the value of women was not a high value in the Puritan society. Even though they were the first to kind of put laws into place that helped um, curtail some domestic violence, they still viewed women as less than men. And we have to be very clear about that. Patriarchy was a real thing. Truly, patriarchy was a real thing up until the 1960s in America, when women kind of got the right to vote and things like that. So you kind of see that they brought patriarchy with them to the New World, and they really kind of clashed with the people who were here, the Native Americans, and they kind of made it their mission to encapsulate the Native American culture, and those who wouldn't conform to it were expelled to new lands or reservations, and those who stayed were indoctrinated through the use of boarding schools to kind of change their outlooks. So then we get to the American Revolution, and I can't help but kind of tell you a little bit about the American Revolution because I also teach American government, not for Georgia Southern, but for a different college. So, what do we know about the American Revolution? Well, the American Revolution was about freedom, and it really was about breaking away from oppression. So when we say freedom, do we really think that the American Revolution was about freedom? My answer to that would be yes, in a sense of the way that the societal norms were of the time. So the American Revolution, you had the American colonists who were British citizens coming over to this new world and creating a new culture. However, they were still considered British citizens, and they still had to obey by common law, or the British common law that we talked about. Um, but they were still um, subjected to British taxation. Well, they're thousands of miles away from the British Parliament. And so, as Britain is putting together these new tax laws and tax requirements, they are not including the new colonists in these discussions because the colonists are thousands of miles away in a new world. So the American Revolution was really about breaking away from Britain because there was no way that Britain was allowing the new settlers to have any representation in the parliament. So that's where you get the no taxation without representation, because that truly was what it was about. Um, because you have the whole we still are ruled by a king, but we don't get any say in any of the decision making. So that's truly what the American Revolution was about. Now, you know that the Puritans were the first to kind of put those laws into place that addressed family violence. However, during the American Revolution, there was really a theme around the colonists' thought patterns that they wanted to create a new government, and so they were breaking away from a monarchy who told them and intruded on everything, every part of their lives. So you see this shift during this time to where wife beating returns. And why does wife beating return during the American Revolution? Well, the American Revolution is about freedom. We don't want government telling us what to do. We want to create our own government within reason. And if you've gone through an American government class, you know that there were various thoughts to the Constitution's creation and the Bill of Rights and all of that. But for the sake of this conversation, we didn't want government to intrude in our private affairs. So women were still seen as property. Patriarchy was still real here. And the focus from the community focus of the original Puritans kind of shifted to creating this new government and arguments over how much power should this government have within our daily lives. And so within this, we really kind of wanted less government intrusion in the family affairs. So because less government intrusion in the family affairs occurred, husbands were free to do what they would with their wives. And so you still see the idea of wives being second class citizens and being property. And I say wives, but it's wives and children. And husbands ultimately being responsible for what the wives and children does. So you see a return to the social acceptance of wife beating or of child abuse as we know it during this time, because there was an anti-government intrusion mindset. This mindset was further sorry, I'm trying to write down timestamps for you. This mindset was further kind of, what's the word that I'm looking for? Solidified in a case out of Mississippi known as Bradley v. the State of Mississippi. This was done in 1824. And this is a case where Calvin Bradley was convicted of assaulting his wife. And he appealed that conviction under the notion that common law allows for husbands to beat their wives. So remember, during this time, we're still seeing that although we're trying to break away from the British monarchy, we're still operating under common law ideologies. And Calvin was basically saying, you know, I have the right to strike my wife. If she gets out of line, I can beat her as long as I don't kill her. I'm the one that gets to decide how to appropriately discipline my wife. That was his stance. And so we see that the Mississippi Supreme Court disagreed, theoretically, disagreed with Bradley on his claim that common law allows for husbands to beat their wives without borders. Bradley v. State, even though Bradley lost his appeal, Bradley v. State is still viewed as a detrimental case to family violence and to women. And that is because the Supreme Court basically said the only reason that Bradley lost was because he went too far. He overdid the punishment. Bradley v. State upheld that husbands have the right to chastise or beat their wives within borders, within boundaries. And so ultimately, the Mississippi Supreme Court said, Bradley, the common law doesn't allow for you to beat your wife without any borders. We interpret common law as saying, yes, husbands can chastise their wives or beat their wives, but you can't beat her to death. You can't beat her to where she has broken bones. There are boundaries in which you can discipline, chastise, or beat your wife. That is the essence of the Bradley case, and why it is such a detriment to family violence, is because it ultimately allows for husbands and for that society to be okay with violence against women and children. So notice that this was an 1824 decision, and it was based out of Mississippi, but it was universally kind of seen as the standard under common law. So then we get to 1871. So husbands could beat their wives under the law, and it be okay under Bradley from 1824. And now we're into 1871, and we see the case of Fulgham versus the state of Alabama. And I found this picture. This is supposedly the Fulghams. Take that with a grain of salt. But the essence of this case is that George Fulgham was disciplining his and Matilda's child. And Matilda believed that he was going too far, that he was being too cruel in the punishment. So the child, as they were arguing, the child ran off from George. And George gave chase to the child. And then Matilda gave chase to George. And so, like, you can imagine they're all running. Like, here's the little child, here's George running, and then here's Matilda running, like, no, you can't do that. So, George turns around and beats Matilda because she was disobeying his order to leave him alone and let him discipline his child as he sees fit. So ultimately, George was convicted of assaulting Matilda because they said that he went too far. So they used the Bradley standard and said he went too far because he used, I believe it was a plank, and not like a switch to beat her. So if it was a switch, it would be okay. But because he used a plank, it was not okay. And so George appealed this decision to the Alabama Supreme Court. And the Alabama Supreme Court, I want you to think about this. The state of Alabama was nothing like it is today. But the state of Alabama basically said, whoa, Bradley was wrong. That whole decision was wrong. Mr. Fulgham, you do not have the right to assault your wife. No man has the right to assault their wife. Chastisement is not a thing anymore. You can't assault a woman because she is a person. She should have the same legal protection as any other citizen that we have. Now, with me saying that, let me be clear. In this society, women are still considered second-class citizens. So while they may have the same legal protection, they don't really have the same legal protections. Fulgham basically establishes that husbands cannot beat their wives. So the women of this time during Fulgham, from 1871 forward, no longer has to be subjugated to chastisement by their husbands, which is huge. It was a historical case in the study of family violence. So that's going to bring us up to our modern day understanding of family violence. Wife battering reemerged in the 60s, along with a growing concern over child abuse. And so we really started refocusing our attention on this subject of family violence in the 60s. And in order to kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about family violence, you typically would look at a definition, right? So the definition of family violence varies state by state because family violence is defined by legal statute. And we know legal statutes vary across the nation. However, there are some common themes as far as family violence statutes go. Those themes are that an act has to be perpetrated against a victim which is illegal. And then the perpetrator must be related to the victim in some way. So those are two main themes that we see in family violence definitions. So there are three categories of family violence. So family violence is an umbrella on which these categories fall under. So when we're talking about family violence, we're really talking about any one of these categories. And for your research paper, I am allowing you to kind of further explore these categories and kind of look at different state laws and kind of compare and contrast those with Georgia. So those categories are intimate partner violence, child abuse, and elder abuse. Those three categories make up what we know as family violence. And those three categories make up the study of family violence. So when we study child abuse, we're really studying the main section, family violence. So let's look at intimate partner violence. So the definition of intimate partner violence is violence committed within an adult intimate relationship. And this can account for a continuum of behavior. So intimate partner violence isn't just about physical violence. We're talking about like coercive behavior. And when we say coercive behavior, we're talking about like social isolation, economic deprivation, things like that. We're then talking about verbal and emotional abuse. And then finally, you have physical and sexual abuse. We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail toward the end of this presentation. But when we say the word domestic violence, a lot of people think, or when we say the word family violence, a lot of people automatically go to intimate partner violence, which is the new word for domestic violence. Intimate partner violence is more inclusive because LGBTQ families fall into intimate partner violence as well. So when we say intimate partner violence, know that we're talking about the continuum of behaviors that are violent, considered violent, that are committed within the adult intimate relationship. That is what intimate partner violence is. Now, I've included the annual rate of non-fatal intimate partner victimization chart from your textbook in this presentation right there, as you can see it. The first thing that should stick out to you is that the rate of intimate partner violence the rate of intimate partner violence, I can't think of the word that I'm trying to say, but basically intimate partner violence being reported to law enforcement has drastically decreased over the past probably 2 decades. And that's a good thing. So why has that decreased? Well, one reason is because there is now a national mindset around intimate partner violence. So we recognize that this is an issue. We recognize that we need laws that are prohibitive of this behavior. And so we see more laws coming into play that allow police to take action and allow the courts to hold those offenders accountable. Another reason that we see victimization declining is the role of services in our society. Because we recognize the issue of intimate partner violence, the community has met that challenge with increasing service arrays. And that can be through specialized counseling, sheltering, victim services, things like that. All right, so now we're going to talk about child abuse. And as bad as this is to say, this is my forte. Child abuse is my love. Child welfare is my love. And so when we talk about child maltreatment, I'm going to give you a lot of information and a lot of things that aren't necessarily available to you right now as far as how investigators investigate that. And I'm going to spend a lot of time on child abuse because it's something that I'm passionate about. So child abuse is defined by state and federal laws, and it varies state to state. If you choose child abuse as your research topic, you're going to find that different states have varying degrees of law that dictate kind of what constitutes child abuse. However, federal law is in place. CAPTA, or the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act of 2011, is the federal law that sets the minimum standards for what states have to include in their child abuse laws. Within CAPTA, it sets out that there should be 4 different types of child abuse in state statutes. So when we talk about child abuse, we're going to talk about these 4 different types of child abuse. These types constitute child abuse as a whole. So when you hear child abuse, you think, or you should think, physical abuse. That's the physical hurting of children. Sexual abuse. You think of emotional or psychological abuse. But then you have this thing that is really hard to understand called neglect. And neglect constitutes child abuse. So now we're going to go over to elder abuse. And we're going to come back to some of this stuff later in this presentation. So don't fret too much. So elder abuse involves physical, sexual, emotional, psychological violence, neglect, abandonment, or financial exploitation. And there are typically 2 categories of elder abuse. The first category is domestic elder abuse. And this refers to any form of maltreatment that we talked about, that physical, sexual, emotional, psychological, neglect. Of an older person by someone who has a special relationship with that older person, such as a spouse, a sibling, a child, a friend, or a caregiver in that older person's home. So like if you hire a nurse or hire a caregiver to come and sit with your elderly parents and take care of them, if that person mistreats your parents, that would be considered domestic elder abuse. Then there is institutional elder abuse. And institutional elder abuse is any form of abuse that occurs in residential facilities for older people. So the main difference between the categories, domestic and institutional, is the perpetrator. Who is perpetrating the violence against the elder or the older person? So remember, institutional elder abuse is normally an employee of that institution, whereas domestic elder abuse is typically family, friend, social connection of that older person. So we've talked a lot about family violence, but we haven't really defined what constitutes a family relationship. Until now. We're going to do that right now. So I'm going to ask you, what constitutes a family relationship? Well, family relationships are typically defined by blood marriage relationships or cohabitation. However, the legal definition of a family relationship varies from state to state. So you typically have our understanding definition, like our generalized definition of what we think of, but then you will have legal definitions of legally what constitutes X, Y, and Z. So the legal definition of family is defined by statute in the state that you're in. However, there are some common themes that when looking at the various states that we kind of see permeate throughout the legal statutes. So the first one is legal marriage. If you're married, you typically are considered family. People who cohabitate or reside together um, typically are considered family. If you're related through marriage or share a child in common, you are in a legal family relationship. So if John and Sarah have Maddie, John and Sarah may be divorced, but they're still considered in a family relationship because they share Maddie as a child. So let's say John and Sarah don't have Maddie yet, but Sarah is pregnant, and John and Sarah are together or they're separated, but John beats up Sarah. They're still considered family because John is the presumptive father of Sarah's baby. So if John beats up Sarah, it still falls in the family violence law because generally, if there is a pregnant woman and a presumptive father, that fits a legal definition of family. Going on, biological and stepchildren and biological or step parents constitutes a family relationship. And then same-sex couples who cohabitate are also considered a family relationship. So when we talk about family violence, we're really kind of talking about the family unit. And this definition, or these themes throughout the various legal definitions, are what we're really talking about as far as that family unit goes. All right, so let's talk about some types of family violence. So, types of family violence, we talked about the categories of family violence. So, elder abuse, child abuse, and intimate partner violence. And then we hit on some of the types of child abuse, right? Well, it's not just child abuse. This is really types of family violence, the violence itself. So the first one that you have is neglect. And neglect is really kind of an abstract concept that people struggle with. I can't tell you how many times I was training new workers in the child welfare field who could not wrap their head around neglect. Neglect is one of the most frequent forms of child abuse in the state of Georgia, and it's one of the hardest to kind of wrap your head around. So let's try to wrap our head around it. Neglect is defined as the failure or refusal to provide care or services for a person when there is an obligation to do so. So in essence, neglect is a failure to act or a total inaction of a caregiver. So let's say little Johnny needs mental health medication, bipolar medication. Mom could be considered neglectful if she refuses to give him that medication, or if she totally just doesn't deal with it and doesn't take him to see a doctor to get prescribed medication. So in elder abuse, if your parent needed diaper changes and you failed as their caregiver to change their diapers, and that resulted in bed sores, and then the bed sores resulted in the person getting gangrene and having to be hospitalized, your neglect caused the violence that happened to that person, or was a direct correlation to the hospitalization. So that's neglect. The next form of violence is physical abuse. So physical abuse is the use of force or threat of violence that may result in bodily injury, physical pain, or impairment. So when we think about abuse, our mind typically goes directly to physical abuse because we're thinking of little Johnny or Granny Jane or Maria, who is in a relationship with Robert, having a broken arm as a result of an action from that person or from that person's spouse or caregiver. So that's physical abuse. Then you have another abstract form of abuse known as psychological abuse. And I will tell you from my own experience in child welfare, I had like 3 cases of psychological abuse in my 9 years. They were the hardest cases to work because psychological abuse is so hard to investigate and so hard to gather evidence on. But psychological abuse is the intentional infliction of anguish, pain, or distress designed to control the victim. Psychological abuse can be verbal or nonverbal, and the whole point of psychological abuse is control. We are mentally controlling you. Again, that coercive behavior in intimate partner violence falls under psychological abuse. And then finally, there is sexual abuse. And sexual abuse is the non-consensual sexual contact of any kind, or is sexual contact with a person incapable of consent, whether it's mentally incapable or due to the age of the person, they're incapable under the law of consenting to sexual relationships. This includes minors. So those are your 4 types of family violence. It's good to kind of screenshot this, put this up somewhere, keep this handy, because as we go through, we will be looking at the different subcategories of family violence. And within those subcategories, we'll be looking at these types of violence. So you can have kind of a cheat sheet. All right, so that's going to conclude our lecture today. I hope everyone enjoyed the lecture. You learned something. I will have this time stamped so that you can go back and look at whatever you need to. If you need, if I went too fast over something or something like that, you can go back and re-listen to it. As always, if you need me, feel free to reach out to me. Come by my office in Carroll or email me. And I hope you all have a good week. Bye.